Welcome to all of our attendees. Thank you very much for joining us. I'm Tim Taylor with the Sacramento Clean Cities Coalition, and we're really happy to be able to produce this event today and in cooperation with the MEMA, the Municipal Equipment Maintenance Association, NAFA, the National Association of Fleet Administrators, and the East Bay Clean Cities Coalition, the San Diego Clean Cities Coalition, and the Long Beach Coalition. So on behalf of the coalitions and those groups, I'd like to welcome you and thank you all for joining us. Keith Leach is the president of the Sacramento Clean Cities Coalition. He's also affiliated with both MEMA and NAFA. And Keith, would you like to say a little bit of a welcome to everybody, please?
Absolutely, Tim. Thank you very much. On behalf of MEMA, NorCal, and Southern California, and also the NAFA chapters in California, this has been a really valuable collaboration of our groups to get the word out about the upcoming mandates for California fleets and even fleets that operate in California that aren't based here. And we've had two presentations. They're on the agenda, the 24th of February, March 11th. If you haven't had a chance to view those yet or participate, I would encourage you to go to the cleancitiessacramento.org website where those can be viewed. And at this point, now we're going to hand it off to Tim, and he's going to go through our agenda. And at the very end of this presentation, we're going to have a panel discussion that we can get a Q&A out and identify what our questions are about this particular topic. So thank you very much, and continue to support MEMA and NAFA. And we'll catch you at the end of this presentation. Thank you very much.
Great. Okay. So again, as Keith said, this is the third in a series. The first two were related to the regulations that the Air Resources Board is implementing, and the third is today with some information about how incentives and funding strategies can work, and to start and the planning for how you can make the transition that is going to be required in order to comply with the regulations that the Air Resources Board has been working on. So to start off, we're going to ask Chris White, who's Senior Program Manager at Frontier Energy, to do a presentation on funding and planning for EV transitions.
Thanks everybody for inviting me to speak with you today. And if you are expecting either a long list of programs that say, here's free money, go get it, or 22 slides about regulations, I'm going to disappoint you on both of those things. Instead, I'm going to talk to you about some practical experience that we have had as we have been working with fleets across the country to help them develop transition plans to get to all electric vehicles. And Tim did talk about those CARB regulations, and I do want to remind everybody too, right now there's a lot going on in Washington, D.C. with reauthorization of the transportation bill. There's some changes in CMAQ funding, and you're probably aware that our president has now set a goal of everybody moving to electric. So we do have today's requirements in front of us, and then we have a lot of unknown of what might happen in the next 4 years. But like I said, I'm going to talk to you today about really practical experience. And as I've worked with fleets for the last, 10 years, about thinking about how you move into this, there's been one thing really consistent, and that is when you get a group of people together to talk about what your transition looks like, everybody kind of has a different view of what that end result was. And I've walked into things where I've heard, oh, this company promised me it was going to look like this, and instead it looked like this. Or here's my plan, and this is everything we thought we were going to get, and it was only budgeted for this. Or this plan went into place, and it looked great on paper, but the person who was implementing it wasn't part of the planning, and they implemented it really differently. We've seen this over and over again. And so what I first want to talk to you a little bit about today is some things that I suggest you do to get ready before you even start your plan. This is a picture. This is a result of a fleet transition plan we did for one municipal government. Right now, Frontier Energy and our partners at Gladstein Neandros and DKS Associates are working on a project that's been funded by East Bay Community Energy to help 6 municipal fleets budget and plan for their 10-year transition. So I'm giving you the bottom line dollars on what we came up with for this particular city. And some of what I'm going to walk through with you as a result of a practical application of this first city as well. So the first thing that we learned with with the East Bay project, as well as the other fleets that we work with, is most fleet managers give us a spreadsheet and says, this is the vehicles that we have. We have found none of these to be accurate. Zero, we're batting 1,000 on this one so far. None of them are accurate. So I encourage you to really think about the vehicles. Do you really have these in the inventory? And what we most often run across is a vehicle was wrecked or taken out of service and it's just not been updated yet. This department traded a vehicle with that department and it hasn't been updated yet. Something was replaced and it wasn't updated yet. And yet, by the way, that yet can range from last week to several years ago. One fleet, not in the East Bay Community Energy Project, a fleet in Massachusetts, it took us 18 months to inventory their vehicles, and actually we had to go count their police cars because they weren't even sure how many police cars they have. So first thing is just to make sure that you really have it in there. Next is to make sure the make and model match the fuel type. And this is, again, that no-brainer if you're using whatever inventory software or an Excel spreadsheet. You might replace the VIN with one VIN with another and update the make, model, and year, but not have thought to change the fuel type. There's a quick way to do this. There is a Department of Transportation has a VIN checker, and you can really quickly drop up to 50 VINs in this VIN checker. It will run through it. It will just say, this VIN matches this make, model, year, and fuel type. And you can see that that matches one by one. And at the end of this, I will drop the URL for the VIN checker into the chat so everybody has it. The next part is knowing which department really has the vehicle. And this again comes down to that swapping or trading, or people retiring something and not saying it, or this vehicle has always been parked here, but now someone's taking it home overnight. And this again may be a physical count of cars, because even if you're using something like Fleet Karma or some other type of vehicle tracking software, it doesn't necessarily reflect that a vehicle was transferred from one department to the other. And the final one is really knowing where it sleeps at night. We have again found that almost no fleet has a good idea of where their vehicles park overnight. And in one particular plan, again, not East Bay, but in another state, we were planning for most vehicles to be parked at a corp yard, when it turns out an awful lot of those vehicles were being left at a department and an awful lot of them were being taken home at night. And that is something that if you're using a GPS system, you should be able to tell from a GPS, but we found a very small number of fleets are using GPS yet. So know who and where your vehicles are. The next one is to really understand the operation. The most important thing to know is, particularly with, totally with charging vehicles, they need to charge when they're sitting still. And you need to know how long it sits still, how often does it sit still, where does it sit still. This is really important because your charging infrastructure may not need to be at the domicile. If you have a car that's picked up at a fleet yard and yet it's spending most of its day over at a transfer station, that's where we should be putting in the charging. We really want to shift as much charging as possible to the off-peak hours. And so it makes sense to build it up where it sits still during the day rather than where it sleeps at night. The other thing, I know that you guys always look at duty cycles and who uses this vehicle and what job does this support. We found that quite often that vehicle and that job are just there because that's the way it was always done. To tell you like a off-topic story that's related. My daughter-in-law, the first time I was at her house and she made a pot roast, she cut the pot roast in half and put it in the pan. I had never seen that before, and I asked her about it. She said it's because her mom did it that way. Her mom said her mom did it that way. Grandma did it that way because she didn't have a pan that was big enough for a pot roast. So, really think, do I really need an SUV to support this activity, or would a wagon be better? Do I really need to have this type of vehicle running a CCA camera for sewer inspection, or could this fit in a small wagon? In fact, as we talked to some of the folks that were driving SUVs, because that was the vehicle assigned to them, they actually said they would prefer to have something like a Chevy Bolt or a little wagon. It had sufficient cargo space in it, and it was actually easier to park, particularly in an urban area. You also want to understand who fuels the vehicle and where. In some cities, they're not tracking the fueling. Instead, the folks that drive cars have fleet cards and they're charging fuel. So when we're looking at fuel use, all we see are credit card numbers, and they don't even have the location of the fueling station on them. So we are unclear if that tank is being filled every day. Are they running it to empty before they refill it? Is it being filled by somebody in a fleet yard, or is it a driver who's responsible for it? So just knowing that also helps figure out what a fueling or a charging schedule is going to look like. We also tend to plan for vehicles on their typical day. This car usually drives 23 miles a day and then sits in parks. However, it's interesting that we were doing a number of these fleet transitions as the pandemic started a year ago, because once the pandemic started, a number of cities kicked into their Office of Emergency Services mode, where vehicle operation had to be done differently. Every car had to be full all the time. They had to be ready for certain types of emergencies. We had suddenly vehicles that sat still usually for 90% of the day and may have driven 10 miles a day. We're suddenly driving 100 miles a day. So you really want to look at that exceptional day and make sure you're planning for that. And that includes vehicles that are needed for emergencies. We tend to think it's trash pickup and refuse trucks and I'm sorry, I got a message from my IT desk that just popped up on my screen. We think of those our emergency vehicles as needed for emergencies, but when you think of a power outage or a potential situation where we had lots of protests in the street, they are different vehicles that are used for emergencies. And then many of us are seeing a change in the way these fleet vehicles are operated due to COVID. And for some places, it will go back to life as normal. For some, it will not. And a good example of this is city inspections. We had inspectors running out all over the place to look at electrical and plumbing, everything that they typically needed to do. During COVID, in many cities, that became a virtual inspection where the homeowner or the contractor would walk around with a cell phone camera and show the inspector who was sitting back in the office. So when you look at some of those changes in processes, it's important planning forward to know which ones might resume, which ones may stay the same as they are today, and which ones may be a hybrid approach. And I'd love to give you some practical advice on that. We're still figuring that out with our current clients as we go. But I would say many of our clients are planning for smaller fleets and reduced vehicle use as a result of some of the changes of process. All right, now let's talk about a little bit of your replacement plan. If you remember that first slide I showed you, we looked at things in a series of years, and we looked at it over a series of budgeting years and how much do I budget for. Our plan is looking specifically at 2030 for most of our clients. One of the first questions that we ask is which vehicles cannot be replaced with a cost-competitive EV? that vehicle, like a fire truck, isn't available. The vehicle may be not available. It might need to be replaced this year or next year, and yet something like a four-wheel drive pickup truck won't be available till later in the cycle. So first identify everything that can't be replaced and figure out if you can switch to a renewable fuel for a period of time and still comply with the CARB regulations. The next I touched on a little bit is, can you replace an SUV with a wagon? Does it have to be four-wheel drive? Are there some things that you could change back and forth? The next thing to look at is your customized and upfitted. And a great example for this is a county that we're working with right now that runs a jail transport system. On paper, it looks like their passenger vans could very easily move to EV passenger vans, but because they're doing prison transport, they have a lot of upfit on the inside. And in those particular vans, it may be more cost effective to take that van that exists now and change the motive power rather than to buy an EV van and make the same modifications inside the vehicle. So figure out which way of those might work as well. If you recall back on my first slide too, we also added a line item so that every year we could bring in a vehicle for evaluation. That might be a refuse truck, that might be a fire truck, it might be some other thing. But we found that most of our fleets aren't budgeting money for bringing in eval vehicles. And one thing to consider is a group that we're working with in Minnesota. They are a bunch of small cities. They are pooling funds to get one vehicle to share. And then they are taking turns over a period of time to operate that vehicle and also share their experience with it. And I know that has a lot of ramifications on who licenses and who owns and who takes care of it, but it's working for this little group of cities. So figure out when you need to bring those in, budget for those, and then you might consider if you can use mobile chargers during evaluation. Sometimes just putting in a charging infrastructure for an eval vehicle makes the whole thing unrealistic. But now there are some really good mobile charging options that could work well for a short period. And then the last thing is you really got to figure out if hydrogen makes more sense. Charging is a function of a building or a parking lot. We've gotten into places where tearing up a reinforced a concrete floor that's been reinforced with iron, or a parking lot has so much plumbing running underneath it that just putting in a charger is going to cost way more money than is affordable. One of our transit clients put in a couple of chargers and then found out it was going to be $500,000 to get that charger connected to the grid. So know that at some point, it may be cheaper to buy a hydrogen station or use a hydrogen station rather than to try to put in charging infrastructure. I talked a little bit there about it being a function of a building, and I want to show you an hour-by-hour load profile of an existing parking garage. The top picture shows hour by hour what the average energy use of that parking garage is without charging. And you'll see the blue shaded line is kind of the average. The bottom line, that's tiny dots, shows you the lowest day. And then the top line with bigger dashes shows the maximum day. Once we figured out, we put the chargers in there and figured out what the charging profiles would look like, you can see how much it increased the peak. So as you're doing your budget, you really want to pay attention to the fact that when you add charging, it is not the only thing that is part of that building. The charging is almost always on a separate meter and you can meter it separately, but it could throw the whole building into a peak. And then what we've been doing is looking at how we can offset that with energy storage or with solar panels, but not every building can support that. This one was a parking garage with an open roof. There's no place to put a solar panel. This one's a parking garage with very dense lower floor. There's really no place to put energy storage systems. so it doesn't work in every location. And a consideration for this type of unit is to figure out maybe you need a third-party application that does load balancing, or maybe you want some of these cars to charge during a different time of the day, or maybe you want to move some of your fleet vehicles to a different location to get your load balanced out a little bit. So now let's talk about the funding part of it. Again, not a list of free money sources. A couple of the things to think about as you put your budget together. We regularly hear the prices of EVs are going to come down, and that is true. However, you have a trade-off. You can either get a lower priced short range EV or more expensive long range EV. We're being really conservative and assuming that most fleets will always choose for a longer range vehicle, and therefore prices will slightly increase. And what I've been doing is taking the prices from negotiated fleet prices and adding an escalation factor about 3% per year, and assuming that car prices will continue to increase with the pace of inflation. It's not perfect, but it gives me a good number. Your operating costs, as you're looking at how much you're going to use to charge those, make sure you're factoring in that at least a percentage of your charging is going to be at peak power, and make sure if you're looking 10 years ahead, you're putting in a rate escalation too. Rates tend to adjust about every 2 years, so you want to assume that that's going to escalate as well. Again, being really conservative, I do not build in rebates and incentives in the budget. I say, here's the budget without rebates, incentives, and grants. Here is the potential for getting them. And that just means if we do get them, it decreases the cost or it gives us a little extra money to spend on something else. But rebates, incentives, that's a year-by-year thing. And we never know when they're going to run out or go away. Mike's going to talk about the LCFS credits. And Mike, this is the conversation we've had before. Just be really clear on who's getting those credits. We've had quite a few customers who have counted on the LCFS credits and then discovered after the fact that because they got a sweetheart deal or took an incentive, they do not get the LCFS credits, and that's throwing the budget out of the water. And I'm sure Mike's going to talk about that a little bit. When you're doing the electrical work, do it once. If you remember the chart at the beginning, we had all of our EV charging in the first 2 budget years. Every time you break concrete, it costs money. So figure out what you think you're going to need and overbuild. Don't think you're going to go back and build again and again and again. And finally, that funds for vehicle evaluation. I've been estimating somewhere between $98,000 and $100,000 a year to bring in an evaluation vehicle. That could be really high for a small fleet. And again, if you get something like a CaliVIP, hybrid incentive program, I've forgotten my acronyms. If you get a grant on it, that brings it down a little bit. If you get a rebate on it, that brings it down a little bit. But I'd rather plan for not having the money, but I'd rather plan for doing an evaluation unit. Okay, here's my list of money. CMAQ. That's the Congestion Mitigation Air Quality funding that comes from Department of Transportation, flows through Caltrans. In some locations, the way that it's implemented, you can use CMAQ money to do this planning. So check with whoever is providing your CMAQ money, your air district, your metropolitan planning organization, to see if you can use it for planning. In some cases, we have been able to use facilities budgets instead of fleet budgets to do panel upgrades, to put in the PV and the energy storage required because it also supports the building. You may find that your utility also helps with panel upgrades. For instance, if they have an efficiency program to do X, and that X includes some panel work or electrical work, that may also be able to cover what you need to have done for future EV planning. The next thing to think about is energy storage and backup generators could that come from Office of Emergency Service Planning? Because it is for resiliency. And again, those things can support buildings in addition to vehicle charging. Some utilities also have funding for doing utility side of the meter upgrades. However, that funding can be price dependent. PG&E has one right now. If you put in charging stations, they'll do this other side, but there's a limit on how far they could go up. So figure that out too before you get started, because you don't want to have that $500,000 upgrade. I mentioned before, we're partnering with EBCE on this program. They're supporting some fleets in doing this planning. Is that available through your CCA, or are you part of a regional energy network that might support this type of work, or potentially even an MPO, a metropolitan planning organization that might support it? And then the last thing I want to mention is to keep an eye out for upcoming block grants. There are new grants that will be coming this summer and fall from the Energy Commission. Some of those programs are still in development, but they're going to work a little differently than our current programs have done. Our currents are, buy a charger, will give you a rebate. They're looking more at how they can do larger numbers together rather than one-by-one funding. So just pay attention for those, and I don't know how they're going to be implemented yet, but they're coming.
But I was going to mention that I believe it was San Diego, was it Gas and Electric, provided a public notice, might have been a year ago, that they expected that they would need a 30% rate increase by 2023, I think it was. And so I think you were saying you expect something like a 3% increase in rates, but it could be significantly more than that. And I have also heard the Air Resources Board saying that they are going to mandate that utilities pick up the tab for outside the fence upgrades that need to be done for fleets. I don't know how that's going to play out, but in that case, they're going to have to find the money to do that somewhere. And
yes,
that will be bigger increases.
And I know I talked fast and I hit a lot of numbers. I figure a 3% per year increase on the price of the car.
Oh.
Utility rates are really mercurial, and it depends on whether you're with an investor-owned utility. You get a lot more foresight of what they plan. They're usually like 2 years in advance. Municipals might be a little different, but every utility has to be very transparent about planned increases. But when you're starting to look into 2028, 2030 for forecasting use, they don't plan that far in advance. Just plan for an escalation factor that is similar to escalations you've seen in the past.
And I see that you put the VIN checker information in the chat. Thank you very much for that. And so
you've been using that VIN checker, haven't you?
I have been, and it's fascinating. It works for heavy duty as well, which is great. And I have noticed lots of cars that are gasoline powered happen to be plug-in electric in the inventories that get submitted. So it is true that fleets, I think, have difficulty getting all that information in correctly.
And thank you very much, Tim and team, for the opportunity to be here with you all. And thanks, Chris, for your presentation and for teeing this up. So Chris referenced LCFS. It is a fundamentally different incentive, if you will. And so you need to think of it very differently. A lot of the grants and incentives with which, to which Chris was referring are there to, in large part, reduce the capital that's required to deploy these projects. LCFS and like environmental commodity programs are a recurring stream of proceeds or income that gets deposited into your bank account. There is no upfront cost. And it may sound a little crazy and hard to believe, but it's very true. So as long as you have qualifying equipment and the rights to the credits, and you haven't assigned them away, sometimes unknowingly, you can get paid via California LCFS with zero out-of-pocket cost. So if that's what you're here to learn, we will dig into it. It is probably the case where a lot of you have eligible equipment and you could be making money today and are not. Let's fix that. We will go through some of the key things you need to know about whether or not you can, and how to position yourself to benefit from these programs in the future. So here's what we're going to cover today. It's to touch on what the heck these things called environmental commodities are. LCFS is a leading example of such programs. We'll go deeper into what California LCFS is and how you can participate, and we'll look to the future a bit of where it's going and what you can expect on, is this thing really kind of here today, gone tomorrow? Is it going to be here for a long time? And how much should you really allow it to impact your planning? And the answer is significantly. We'll talk about that. And then finally, some key strategies, things you have to think about to make sure that you can access the programs and benefit from them. Because to Chris's point, some may have unintendingly locked themselves out of the program, and we want to fix that or prevent it in the future. So I'd like to introduce us more fully and let you know that my co-speaker here today is a gentleman named Evan Rosenberg, Senior Manager, Client Development and Policy at SREC Trade. He'll share a little bit more about his background here in just a moment. My name is Mike Saxton. I'm the Managing Director for Clean Transportation at SREC Trade. And so originally I'm an engineer. I was trained as an industrial engineer and then experienced as a nuclear power plant operator. So power generation and distribution and consumption were where I began my career. I was in the Navy driving ships and running power plants. Through my career, I've built a few companies, most recently at a company called Orange EV. So manufacturer of all electric yard trucks, the first of the Class 8s that have been successfully deployed. When I was ready to move on after building the company, we had gotten the company to deployments across 16 states and 3 countries. Now, why to bring that up? It's because as a part of that, we had to become experts, and I became very familiar with the various forms of grant incentive programs and how to apply them for the benefit of our fleets, so our customers, so they'd buy our big expensive trucks and have the funds needed to pay for the full solution, knowing that you have infrastructure costs, charging equipment costs, and the vehicle costs. Among these programs, one is fundamentally different, or one class. These are the environmental commodity programs, namely LCFS, that we'll talk about here today. I used SREC Trade exclusively to realize the benefits of the program for my fleets. Evan, if you would, share a little bit more about your background.
Sure thing, Mike. Again, my name is Evan Rosenberg, Senior Manager of Client Development and Policy here at SREC Trade. My background is actually in public transit, where I was managing environmental and climate programs, energy and climate programs for the transit agency down in Los Angeles, known as LA Metro. When I started, LCFS was a brand new program. In fact, there weren't even any credit trades occurring. It was brand new. And I built that program from scratch and managed it for about 8 years. And it was incredibly impactful for us. You can see some numbers on the slide. But that helped us transition to renewable natural gas, which I oversaw. Our fleet of 2,200 buses going from traditional CNG to RNG, managing the emissions and environmental commodities associated with that, and helping support our deployment of public EV chargers at our stations and our bus electrification program, which is now growing quite quickly. So I've been involved in LCFS for about 8 years. And I chose to join SREC Trade after becoming in contact with them because we were looking to take our LCFS program to the next level. And I decided to actually join SREC Trade so I could focus exclusively on environmental commodity programs and help other fleets get the most out of them. I'll talk a little bit more about that in my slides coming up, but I'll pass the mic back over to Mike.
Thank you, Evan, very much. So please, everyone, know that we are here as resources and partners. We've both in our company have been through the trenches in a lot of ways through the years, to understand the challenges and some of the ways to overcome those challenges, namely funding in this case, to help pay for the deployment and operation of the cleaner pieces of equipment that you need to adopt. Continuing now, let's get into the teaching objectives. So what the heck are these things called environmental commodities? Well, they're regulatory mechanisms. They're air, they're intangibles, but they are very, very real. So, and growing in popularity, not just in California, but across the country. So regulators have figured out that they can use the market to realize their emission reduction, greenhouse gas reduction strategies. Some of those directly impact the vehicles you're trying to deploy and the infrastructure, charging equipment required to power them. So we're going to focus on compliance-related environmental commodities. There are other types you'll hear about, voluntary credits, carbon offsets, etc. So there are a number of these different kinds of environmental commodities. The ones that are most relevant are the compliance-related, and namely, low carbon fuel standard as an example of clean fuels programs, and then renewable energy credits, or RECs, as an example of, well, renewable energy commodities. So let's go ahead and dig it in, and we'll get into a little bit further, but know that these are highly successful regulatory programs that are driving the kind of changes that the regulators are looking for. So they're not slowing down, they're only accelerating. So if you're not taking advantage of them, planning for them, making decisions based upon them, you may find that you're missing some big opportunities to make different decisions, better decisions around the technology paths you're choosing and the impact to your budgets, because you could be benefiting economically today. So these environmental commodities have actually been around for quite a while. And SREC Trade was, as a company, was born when environmental commodities were first innovated years ago. And thus the name, it's kind of a funny name. It's SREC Trade, really born of solar renewable energy credit trading, when the first of these environmental commodities, RECs, were innovated to, for the utilities, the obligated entities under that body of regulation, to force them to green the grid, if you will, and take more renewable source of electricity into the grid that then is distributed through to you to power your electric equipment. SREC Trade is 100% focused on environmental commodities and how we help manage and monetize them. So we plug in to your organization to turn all of that use of the equipment you already have into money for you in compliance with very complex regulatory programs. We're really good at it. You'll see from some of the stats there, we are the largest agent manager for EV assets for California LCFS. Over the years, year over year, we have greater than a 99% annual customer retention rate. And it's not because they have to stay. Our terms are very short and forgiving, so they stay because they want to. A lot of assets that we manage actively for other parties, so like school districts, transit agencies, municipalities. And we operate today across 10 compliance markets and with 20 unique tradable commodities. We're plugged in to the regulatory working groups. And so in California, we have a working relationship with CARB, not only on the policy development, but on the day-to-day management of the programs and on behalf of our clients. So we know them, we know the regulations well, we know the processes well, and we know what they really mean when they say, this is what the program rules are and how to make it happen. And we have a lot more than just people that are experts. It's also technology and a platform that enables our activity and helps deliver a lot of that value to you so that you have visibility to what's going on your behalf under these programs. Here's the other thing, not only have programs been around for a long time, but everybody's doing it. Everybody, or all these different market sectors are already using California LCFS. and these are clients of ours. So whether you're the largest third-party contract logistics provider in the world or a small warehouse and distribution fleet operator with just a couple charging stations in the Port of Oakland, or transit agencies, municipalities, small and large, across the board, they all use us to manage and monetize those environmental commodities for them. And most of them are taking very much a learn while doing approach, because it is complex until you're really in it, and we're registering your assets, we're working through what it takes to be able to report the usage and generate credits and turn it into money. You don't really understand it. So just know that we embrace the learn while doing approach and are willing to make the commitment up front to help the organization really walk through learning while doing what the program can mean, what the regulations can mean to you. California LCFS, what is it? So down and dirty, it is a compliance program for the petroleum industry. And it is something of a cleanup or pay up program. So in the pink, you see that there is well, let's look at the line, the black line with the dots. Those dots are the carbon intensity reduction that has to be occurring. So the petroleum refiners have to clean up their diesel fuel or their gasoline. If it does not meet the CI or carbon intensity standard, they generate deficits. And that's the case. A lot of them today, they don't refine the diesel fuel to meet the standard. And so at the pump, gallon by gallon, they're creating deficits. By the way, this program is funded. So unlike other incentive programs, and Chris mentioned this as well, the money for CORE or Carl Moyer or whatever may come back, it may not. It's hard to plan around. This is very different. This program, LCFS, is funded and you're already paying for it. You might as well get paid back. At the pump, gallon by gallon, there's extra charges on what you pay. That money goes into a pool with the, let's say, the large petroleum providers. And then on a quarterly basis, they either have to settle up or they face even stricter penalties. So the petroleum entities are obligated to meet the standard. When they don't, they create deficits. They need your credits to offset their deficits. By participating in the program, not only are you helping them meet their compliance obligations, but you're making money in the process. You, the operator of the cleaner equipment that exceeds the carbon intensity standard, so let's say electric buses, electric forklifts, electric trucks, etc., you are generating credits, and SREC Trade plugs in to make that happen for you and deposit funds into your bank account. The workflow. So on an initial basis, we register the assets. So in our systems and in CARB systems, and they have to be approved as eligible for the program. Then on a regular ongoing basis, we have to report the actual energy consumed that's cleaner. So whether it's electricity or anything else, CNG, LNG, that has to be reported. And then in the process of a lot of activity with CARB, credits are issued. So this commodity, this tradable commodity, is created. SREC Trade aggregates them, and then through a series of bilateral agreements with entities that we have, so we make the market for this, we sell the credits to those obligated entities, the refiners and importers. When we have the proceeds paid to us, we then turn right around pro rata and pay our clients. Our fees are taken out of those proceeds, and this is how you can make money from California LCFS and like programs with no out-of-pocket costs. SREC Trade does all the work up front to help you understand how to use the program, to register your assets, to report the usage, to generate the credits, aggregate, sell them, turn it into money, and then flow the proceeds back to your bank account. We do all of that so you don't have to. It is an ongoing revenue stream. It's market-based, so how much you would make depends, but it's a significant amount of money and it's more than zero. So when I say market-based, what does that really mean? Well, so it's a market of buyers and sellers. There is a supply and a demand. The obligated entities need those credits. Based upon a supply of those credits and who's willing to sell them at what price, the market agrees to a price. So what you're seeing in front of you is the historical average for that per LCFS credit price. You'll note for the last couple years, it's been hovering very close to the maximum allowed per CARB. So to make sure the petroleum industry, the obligated entities, were willing to participate collaboratively, there was a maximum per credit price set. That's just under 218 bucks. Every year that price is adjusted a little bit. You can see for the last couple of years, it's been really close to that maximum. Most recently trading around $199, $195 in that range. So it's a significant amount of money. Okay, this slide is intended to affirm that the program is not going away. LCFS is here to stay. It's here to stay, and it is actually the model that is being used as like programs expand across North America. SREC Trade works in all these markets, and as the programs open up, we will be there to fill the same role. A lot of the stakeholders here today are focused just on California, so we won't talk about the rest of the country. We did want you to know that California's LCFS is the model, and while the current regulation shows those declines in carbon intensity, so stricter and stricter requirements through 2030, CARB has already said that they're going to be back, and they're probably going to continue that line down, and the carbon intensity required for diesel fuel is going to get stricter and stricter and stricter. That does also mean that the funds that are passed through at the pump for your diesel fuel may continue to increase. It's as if it's not high enough today. So what does it really mean in terms of dollars in your pocket? Here are some examples of what we are paying fleets on different equipment mixes. So you can see here, when it comes to municipalities on the right-hand side, you see in the middle, there's a municipality that's a client, 10 electric buses, they've got 1 CNG fueling station. And because of COVID, very light usage on those assets. Well, annualized, we're paying them about 60 grand. As COVID lifts and the usage goes back up again, that number is going to multiply several times. On the left-hand side, you see another example that's really telling: agriculture. So 150 forklifts, 5 electric yard trucks. We're paying them about $800,000 per year. So it's a lot of money. These are all clients. None of them have to do anything more than operate the fleet they already own. They are learning from their participation in the program and already accelerating their deployment of cleaner equipment because A, they know what it's worth, and B, they know what types of fuel and technologies are favored under the regulation, meaning how much money they could make by going from older forklifts to newer electric forklifts. It's a lot of money. On a per forklift basis, you could be making $3,000 to $5,000 per year per forklift. For, let's say, an electric yard truck, some of you actually own electric yard trucks to move trailers around your yards. For a lighter duty use, meaning maybe day shift only 5 days a week, you might make, $3,000 to $4,000. On a 2 to 3 shift heavier use, we have clients that are being paid between $10,000 and $15,000 per truck annually. And this is just getting started. As you can imagine, these programs scale as you add assets directly. At this point, what I'd like to do is bring back Evan so he can summarize some of the key things you need to know as you go into, well, think about how to, and then use these programs. Evan?
Thank you, Mike. Just wanted to remind everyone too that feel free to drop a question in the chat box. If it's relevant to what I'm speaking on, I'll try to weave it in seamlessly. If not, we'll address it at the end of the presentation during some Q&A and discussion. So the slides that follow are sort of a distillation of strategic and practical considerations that all fleet owners should be aware of when it comes to LCFS. Now, these are coming from our experience, SREC Trade's experience in the environmental commodity and management business. They're also coming from Mike Saxton and Evan Rosenberg's experience being on the side of either an OEM or a fleet who are trying to take advantage of these kinds of programs. As I said in my introduction, I built and managed LA Metro's LCFS program with internal resources, namely myself, and spent a considerable amount of time trying to understand how to most efficiently maximize the program for our purposes, which were to, generate revenue, put that revenue back into electrification and low carbon fuel use, and all of our very ambitious and sometimes mandated sustainability goals. So keep these ideas in mind as you look to your fleet and try to figure out A, how you're going to comply with all these new requirements, but B, long-term planning. So the first and foremost item, and this has already been brought up, which is great, so thank you, Chris, for bringing that up earlier, is the right to credits. So unlike the grant programs that have already been discussed earlier, who actually gets the revenue from an LCFS, like who actually earns the incentive, is not exactly straightforward. The reason for that is because the CARB regulations detail that the owner of the fueling equipment generates the credits in most cases, and that's CNG fueling equipment, electric fueling equipment, and hydrogen fueling equipment. But the right to those credits is fungible, so you can actually transfer those rights to another party. This is very relevant when we're talking about these new opportunities to use a private company to deploy electric vehicle charging systems. When I was at Metro, we received a lot of proposals for this, and there's other companies that are out there that are looking to provide solutions that not just plan and design and install the chargers, but actually maintain them and even own them over the course of 10, 25 years. These are interesting opportunities and they're worth considering. One of the aspects that you need to be aware of when you're considering those agreements is the right to LCFS credits. Who is going to earn, who is going to retain the rights to the environmental commodities, and what are they valued at over the course of that agreement? If you don't understand how the LCFS program works, you don't understand what's at stake, it's possible that you'll end up on the raw end of a deal because you just didn't have the awareness and insight that's required. And in the early stages of this industry, that is often what happens, right? So when it comes to rights to credits, it's a look before you leap situation. We recommend understanding the value. So if you have 10, 20, 30 different types of electric vehicles that you're planning on operating or already operating, how much are those worth? If you're being proposed or pitched charging as a service and there's a $1 per kilowatt hour fee, ask about LCFS credits, understand what the value is, and assess what the best solution is for your fleet. Again, I've seen arrangements that are not favorable for fleets because they weren't aware of at the time, and you could be locked in for a very long time, and it could leave you feeling burned. So we want to avoid that, and we also want to try to fix that if that is the case. Another thing that's important to know, and this is kind of a planning aspect, is access to data. So if you've decided to retain the rights to the credits because you feel that that revenue back in your budgets and back in your pocket is going to be the most advantageous, you need to make sure that you've put systems in place so that you can access the data, because as Mike showed in a previous slide, the reporting of the fuel data is what generates the credits on a quarterly basis. So you need to think about how you're going to access data. Now, this may come, this sort of component is actually relevant at the early stages of planning because certain types of equipment may not have the right kind of data access and output that CARB requires. You know, we've all heard, you know, we've all seen like the quote dumb chargers that are kind of installed for light duty electric vehicle charging. A lot of organizations installed these chargers, they're working for them, but they're not able to generate LCFS credits because they can't access the data. So that's a very important strategic sort of engineering planning sort of thing to consider right off the bat. And there are certain types of equipment and sub-metering devices that will really make it a lot easier for you to do ongoing reporting for 10, 15 years out. There was a question that popped up with telematics. So vehicle telematics do not meet the data requirements for CARB. There's a lot of discussion in the regulatory engagement, which is sort of this bullet point at the bottom, but right now onboard telematics are not sufficient. So you really need charging level data, whether that's a utility grade meter, a sub meter, or a smart meter on the charging equipment itself. Cloud access would be optimal. And of course, SREC Trade can guide you through what works, what doesn't work, and how to fix that if you don't have the right types of equipment. But these are decisions you're going to make very early on in your program, and you'll have to live with them if you don't make the right decision. Another really important aspect of the program that relates to carbon intensity is with regards to the use of renewable energy for your electric vehicles. I'll touch more on that in the next slide, but just keep that in mind that there are opportunities to leverage renewable energy to get more revenue from the program, which is really important. Last but not least, and I already touched on this, for this sort of, you know, strategic aspect of the program, it's a regulatory program. It changes. CARB goes through 2 to 3 year cycles where they make significant changes to the program, and they're overdue for a change right now. Some of the things that we know are going to be discussed in future rulemakings include, you know, changes to data requirements, so maybe allowing onboard telematics with certain requirements, validation of your fuel use, which just means additional auditing and additional documentation, basically more work. Potentially restrictions on how the revenue can be used depending on what type of organization you are. The utilities are already very highly regulated as to how they use that revenue. And then how the program will look beyond 2030. So more stringent requirements, larger incentives, tougher goals. These are all things that CARB needs your input on. There's a lot of people that engage in the stakeholder groups. SREC Trade is one of them. We've been there for a very long time, and we continue to be very active in that space. As a policy person, that's one of the things I focus on quite a bit. But they need the voice of the industry as well. And they need the voice from private entities, public entities, the fleets, municipalities. We want to make sure that this program is as impactful to these entities as possible. And oftentimes there is a little bit of tension within these rulemaking meetings because you have, you know, the Western States Petroleum industry saying we need to make the program weaker. You have electric vehicle proponents saying you need to make the program stronger. And so these are important things that you need to be aware of as a service provider and as an owner's advocate. We'll represent you in these rulemaking meetings and procedures to make sure that the program can be as beneficial as possible to you. Mike, if you don't mind moving on to the next slide. So there was a question about RECs. So this is exactly the answer. So I'll just back up a little bit and explain how this works. So your electric vehicle charging equipment is going to be powered by the grid. There may be some opportunities for a microgrid or some sort of islanding system, but that's not very practical for most circumstances. And you know, the best way to have power for your facilities and your systems and your vehicles is through grid interconnection. Now, the grid, as we know, contains a mix of different sorts of energy sources: oil and gas, renewables, nuclear, water, hydro. And because of that, that has a certain carbon intensity. Because this program is based on carbon intensity, electricity will earn enough, only the number of credits that will earn only a certain amount of credits based on the carbon intensity of the fuel. Now, what CARB allows you to do is to use renewable energy to generate more credits because you have a lower carbon intensity. Initially, the only way to do this was to locate renewable generation where your charging infrastructure was. Again, not practical, very costly, in most instances just not feasible due to real estate and other limitations. It's always good to consider locating renewables, but not necessarily for purposes of LCFS generation, for other sorts of purposes like operational continuity and other emissions reductions. What CARB allows you to do now, this is a new thing that came about from stakeholder regulatory meetings, is use renewable energy certificates, which are another environmental commodity, and pair those with the electricity that your electric vehicles have used. So what that means is that you have to go and purchase another environmental commodity, retire it and report it to CARB. They will verify that this is a valid renewable energy like token, so to speak, and allow you to generate incrementally more LCFS credits. Now, again, why would you go through all that work just to generate more credits? Well, the more credits are worth more money, and they're worth more than the cost of the REC. So it's sort of an arbitrage opportunity. Buy a little bit and get a lot more. Of course, that comes with a lot of administrative and transactional and risk, right? You have to engage in an entirely different commodity market. You have to understand what CARB's requirements are for retiring RECs, and it's very strict to make sure there's no double counting or any funny business. And then you have to manage and track the commodities that you generate and monetize those as well. So I'll talk a little bit more about how SREC Trade will do that on your behalf, but just keep this in mind that if you're trying to get the most out of the LCFS program and you're using electricity or you're using hydrogen through electrolysis, you want to take advantage of REC book and claim or REC matching. So if you're taking notes, write down REC book and claim and circle it, because it's an extremely impactful way to generate incrementally more revenue, and there's no reason not to do it as long as you put the tools in place to take advantage of it. Next slide, thank you. So going back to the program, these are some additional strategies. These are a little bit more practical and tactical, so things to consider as you're building out your electric vehicle program, of course, is you're going to have to manage all the data that comes in. You're going to have to keep track of your assets. Most cases, the assets are the vehicles. In the case of LCFS, the asset is actually the charging infrastructure. So you're going to have to keep track of your vehicles. You're going to have to do your VIN checking, but you're also now going to have registries and tracking for your electric vehicle charging infrastructure. The type, the model, the serial number, the manufacturer, where it's located, how it's operated, sometimes single line diagrams to understand whether it's receiving utility or some other sort of electrical service. At scale, this can become very challenging. I'll just give you an example. At LA Metro, we initially had about 50 public EV chargers. Each one of those was an asset that had to be registered with CARB. Each one of those was a reporting asset, meaning I had to go through a reporting process for each one of those assets. We went from 50 to 100, and I said, all right, I can keep managing this. Then we went to like 175, and then our board of directors said, we want to have 2,300 public light-duty chargers by 2030. And I was just thinking to myself, okay, this is going to get out of hand very quickly. Now I can't just put up my hands and say, well, so what? We're going to get the chargers out there, and that's the most important thing. There's money on the table, significant amount of money, thousands of dollars per charger, and we need that money in order to actually do this program. So you have to think about the scale, and even at a few dozen, it's still going to be a tremendous challenge. And one thing to keep in mind is that CARB is very strict when it comes to data. And so their data requirements for precision for integrity are becoming more strict over time. And so you have to be prepared to be able to provide documentation and to be able to provide even sometimes on-site auditing if that's going to be a requirement in the future. And these are very challenging things that you have to think and add it on to the rest of your fleet planning. One other thing I'll mention about that is that some chargers do allow for, cloud reporting, but others don't. And so you have to think about how you're getting your data, how that data is being accessed and organized and submitted. You cannot just simply do estimates. CARB doesn't accept that, and it won't generate you any credits. There's a little screenshot here, which is just an example of a solution that SREC Trade has built out, recognizing this need. So we've built out a web-based platform that allows for and facilitates and makes easy all of these registration and tracking and reporting and transaction, which I'll get to in the next slide, elements. This is an example. Each one of those line items is a charger is a charging asset, and you can see in real time how many credits have been generated from that asset, the revenue that that asset has brought on, your transactions, the credits you have in your account. And this is an incredibly important feature that we provide. When I first interacted with SREC Trade in my capacity with Metro, LA Metro, I was absolutely blown away by this feature, and it really sold me right away. I was thinking, wow, if I'm going to have, hundreds of assets that I'm going to be managing, a series of Excel spreadsheets is not going to cut it. The tracking registry that CARB provides, some of you are participating in LCFS today, and so I can't see your faces, but if anyone is active in the LRT, if anyone's doing this reporting on their own, you know how limiting and frustrating that system is. And so we're building programs around that, and we're actually working with CARB to try to develop interfaces so that our system can interface directly with their platform, and so you don't even have to ever deal with it again. And if that's one thing that we can deliver to the world, not having to work with the regulators' platforms, I think that we've achieved our mission. Mike, if you don't mind advancing to the next slide. So this is the fun part, right? Monetizing the credits. So you've decided to retain the rights to the credits. You think they're valuable in your pocket and not the pocket of another party. You've started to report your fuel, your kilowatt hours or your therms for CNG, and you're starting to actually bank these credits up, and you're really excited because you can see the numbers, and then maybe you get an email that says the credits are worth 190. You multiply it out. But how are you going to turn that credit into the actual dollar amount, right? How is that going to actually hit your agency's budget? So this is where a lot of organizations just sort of, they're like, we'll figure it out eventually, right? And we were there. I was there at Metro. We figured it out eventually. It took us a couple years, and this was back in 2014. Credit prices were worth not what they're worth now, but it took us a long time to kind of understand how are we going to monetize these things. One of the key things that strategically we didn't quite understand was when. Like, should we hold on to these and then sell them in big blocks? Should we, maybe try to do like a future contract where someone has agreed to purchase them over the long term? The mantra that we recommend, that sort of our strategy, is you should be monetizing these on an ongoing basis. I've interacted with a lot of organizations, and in my capacity with SREC Trade and my capacity with LA Metro as a manager of our own credit system, who are thinking that they're going to beat the market. They're really excited about all this Wall Street bets, GameStop stuff, and they're like, we're gonna sell high and generate low. The reality is that speculating on a credit market is probably not the best idea unless you have access to information that the entire industry doesn't have access to. And so our recommendation is don't try to beat the market. Make the market work for you. The market is a revenue stream. You're supposed to generate an ongoing revenue stream on a quarterly basis for years to come. And this revenue is supposed to reduce the cost of your adoption of low carbon fuels. It's not a game. It's not an investment strategy. It is a market, so you do need to understand the market dynamics, but you have to take them seriously. And what that means is putting in place an ongoing and efficient way to monetize the credit. So, okay, how do you do that, right? One of the things we ran into quickly as a public agency was that we didn't have a mechanism to sell environmental commodities. There was no contract, there was no board authority. No one had ever done this before, and those who had during like the NOx emissions trading had retired a long time ago. So we were left with, you know, no understanding of how to really go about selling these things. Our first sale was for, I think, 25,000 credits. Just shows you the scale of Metro at the time. And it was a 30-day term, meaning we put out an auction, and there were 30 days. Buyers had 30 days to respond. Imagine buying and selling stocks in a 30-day time span, right? We had to kind of work at our credit transaction system, and ultimately it was very challenging and quite inefficient. One of the things that SREC Trade does is we engage in credit transactions. We monetize environmental commodities on a daily basis across 20 different commodity types across North America, LCFS just being one of them. This is something that is very outside of the scope of most fleets, right? Engaging in these markets. So if there was one thing that you would consider in terms of, you know, outsourcing this kind of service, I think engaging in a credit market is probably the one that is the most compelling. Forget about all the other reporting and asset management and efficiency type, you know, administrative work that we do. Just engaging in these sales is very difficult. Some of you may have done, you know, certain spot price market sales. Some of you have probably done different kinds of bids and auctions, and these may work, but there's certain limitations and risks that you're taking on. And SREC Trade can really help you understand how to maximize and optimize that program for you. This is incredibly important when considering this last bullet, which is these sort of innovating financing mechanisms that you're considering in order to actually adopt these fleets. One of the challenges, of course, is upfront capital, long-term operations and maintenance costs. LCFS can help with that, but you need to really have a good plan in place to monetize your credits. Otherwise, it's really just a theoretical value. And as Chris pointed out, theoretical values should be discounted because you don't know exactly what they're going to be over the long term. SREC Trade helps make those numbers real. We take them out of theory and out of planning and turn them into real dollars back in your budgets and back in your pocket. And that's incredibly important when you're at the planning stage of, you know, even though you may not have these assets yet, it's incredibly important at the planning stage. It's even more important when you're actually operating because you should be generating credits. One thing that always gets asked, and it's probably in the Q&A right now, is can you go back and generate credits from previous quarters and years? You can't. You can't generate, you can't report kilowatt hours from last year. It's a quarterly by quarter basis. The good news is the credits don't expire, so those continue to roll over. So if you've generated credits already and you haven't sold them, that's great. If you're not yet generating credits and you have electric vehicles or chargers, even just a few, you really need to consider what you're going to do in order to get to the next level, and we can definitely help you with that. Seeing some good questions come in, but let me just say one note about this slide. This slide is meant to kind of get your head to spin. There's a lot of words on here. This is a summary of just sort of the things that we've done in order to position ourselves to provide this sort of service for you. I'm not going to go through and read each of them, and I think we've actually touched on a lot of these items, but it shows you the, you know, personally, when Chris was going over her slides, my head was spinning because there's so many features and functionalities and capabilities that you need to master in order to effectively transition your fleet, comply with these regulations, and do so in an efficient way. That's for the entirety of the program, right? That's for your entire fleet. The technologies, the fuel types, where you're going to locate the equipment, how you're going to manage charging, how you're going to manage maintenance and training. What you see on the slide here is just to take advantage of LCFS. So of course, you know, the state lawmakers and regulators could have just established a new funding source and said you have to apply for it on a regular basis. They tried to do something a little more elegant by creating a market-based program. I personally think that's great because the market decides what the price for carbon is, and the market decides how those credits are traded. But it does create a need for understanding how to participate in a very new regulatory program that relies on markets. And so in order to do that, you have to engage in this environmental commodity business, which is a business that is quite different from, you know, operating fleets. And so SREC Trade has positioned ourselves to become your partner in doing that. I've seen some really good questions about some of the ways we work with you all, so I want to address those. Up on the slide here is just a summary of what we talked about. And I want you to really consider, given all that information, what sort of options are available to you in order to get the most out of the program. You know, it's not acceptable to just say it's too hard to participate in and we're just going to let it go, because it's a source of revenue and we all need those in order to achieve our sustainability, air quality, emissions goals. One of the things that we are, as a proven partner for credit management and monetization, is a partner that's going to help you plan, understand the value of LCFS, put in place mechanisms that help you access the most amount of revenue, including managing the renewable energy certificate side of the business, the ongoing registration and reporting requirements, and then most importantly, transactions. Now you must be thinking, all right, well, that sounds great, Evan and Mike, you've done a good job selling this, but what is it going to cost, right? So I've seen a couple good questions that have come up about our fee structure, and I want to take a stab at answering those, and then Mike, if you want to jump in, feel free. So in a couple of slides earlier, and Mike, you don't need to go back to them, but I showed you sort of the process, right? So we register credits on your behalf. You will designate SREC Trade as your partner and designee for purposes of reporting to CARB. We manage the ongoing reporting. We work with you to get data. We'll submit quarterly reports and annual reports, and we'll generate those credits, and then we will transact those credits. Now, we don't get paid until we've monetized those credits. So all that work is basically done on your behalf with no out-of-pocket costs. And we don't get paid until we've monetized the credits. So we've sold those credits to a credit buyer. And then we have a fee structure that is a percentage of that proceed. Now the fee structure depends on, of course, the scale, the number of credits you're generating. So for a smaller fleet that's just starting out, the fees are going to be a little bit higher, and we're going to retain a little bit of that money for startup costs so that we can make sure we're continuing to grow our business and paying for our operation costs. As you continue to grow and generate more credits, our fees actually go down proportionally. So there's that, well, not proportionally, but we have tiers, right? So after a certain point, you'll go from a certain percentage to a much lower percentage. The whole purpose of that is to say, you're putting all this work and investment into adopting a low carbon or zero emission fleet, and those revenues need to go back to you over the long term. It's a signal that we're your partner in this. We feel like, you know, the initial investment would pay itself off many times over as you continue to grow, and more of those funds should go back into your budgets. Mike, I'll pass it over to you to add a little bit more.
Yeah, just down and dirty. At a worst case scenario, the smallest generators are going to keep probably at least 80% of the total proceeds in their pockets. For those that grow and scale and very quickly, you're probably keeping closer to 90%. The largest of our customers, then they can have California only and just a few sites worth of assets. They may be keeping, you know, up to 95% of the proceeds. So long story short, it's a lot of money that goes back in your pocket. And our mission, you know, the fact that we just work really hard to put that money back in the pocket of those that are doing all the good work to deploy the cleaner equipment, operate the cleaner equipment, and clean up the environment. Our mission actually tracks the impact that we make as a business on those greenhouse gas emissions. We're just the best in the business at managing these programs, turning it into money, and enabling you to deploy that clean equipment. And we make it easy to get started and easy to leave as proof in the pudding there. So we talk about being able to get started and learn while doing. If it doesn't work out, you'll notice that the term of our agreements are also very short, knowing that not only are you going to like the fact that we're putting so much money back in your pocket, but that, well, we know we're going to earn your business and keep you as clients.
We can get started with any Q&A that might be out there that didn't get asked in the chat. I was kind of curious to hear a little bit from the panel. Are any of the panel members doing their own reporting? And if they aren't, have any of them found ways to use assistance in reporting, and how has their reporting process played out? Maybe from the panel, and then maybe Mike and Evan, you guys can sort of field what happens and see what these guys have to say. So David, you've been looking at EVs for a while. Are you doing your own reporting, or are you working with someone? How's it working out for you? And you are, there you go.
Yeah, we are not generating any credits at this time. Our construction of all of our charging infrastructure isn't going to be going for probably about a year. We've been in planning phases for a couple of years now. You really have to look at the whole as a holistic approach, and everything that you're going to electrify. But I did learn several things here that before we pick our charging company or our charger, making sure that we're going to be able to collect the correct data, because we will be generating quite a few credits, it seems like. So we may be in touch.
And importantly, if you would, Dave, make sure you're not inadvertently in the contractual arrangements with those providers signing away the rights to your credits. Look carefully for those clauses. And
Yes,
we're happy to look at those agreements with you if you like.
I did take a note there that making sure that we don't sign away any credits for any of the electric chargers that we put in. We do have some dumb chargers right now. I wish I would have known that about 5 years ago before I put the last round in, but in the future, or possibly we may be changing those chargers out now.
Well, and on the dumb chargers, you may still be able to we may still be able to monetize those for you. There may be a need to put some extra metering equipment upstream of those charging stations. And it may be that somebody needs to go take some snapshots, but as long as you've got those charging stations dispensing electricity, we can probably monetize it with you. It's just a question of the extra work or a little bit of extra investment that needs to be made to put some equipment in there.
All right, thank you.
And one other thing I wanted to add, with regards to like, when should you think about LCFS in the process of your EV deployment? You really need to start thinking about it early, not just for planning purposes to understand funding, but once you're at the point of, okay, we've selected a contractor, we're breaking ground, maybe we're even a little bit ahead, but we're still a year out. You can get those assets, those chargers registered once they're basically installed. And the reason that I highlight that is because there's a fair amount of commissioning that is involved in testing with the buses and with the chargers themselves. Those kilowatt hours can be reported. So even if it's not running revenue service and you're kind of just testing the bus, you should be gathering all those kilowatt hour data and reporting it to CARB. Now, in order to do that, you need to have a system in place. So even if you're 6 months out, a year out, or even longer, it's worth talking with us and figuring out, okay, when do I time this thing with SREC Trade or with LCFS? How do I get in position? Because we know that once you get those chargers in and you're testing your vehicles, the last thing you're going to be thinking about is low carbon fuel standards. So it's important to kind of get that in place before you get into your testing and commissioning phase.
I see Richard is taking himself off mute, and I suspect he might have a little something to say about the issue, but I also noticed you asked a question that didn't get answered earlier, Richard. So maybe you could, about the contracting. So
Sure. And
I don't know where you want to go, but
related to that, I previously was listening in on my cell phone. I had a couple of meetings going, so it took me a minute to uncamera and unmute. But my personal experience with LCSF began about 3 years ago, and endeavored to undertake this on our own, went through the entire application process. There's a not complex form, but not clear form that we had to run up our chain, I think up to the director level. Got all that done, sent it to ARB, certified, of course, and waited. And I'd say about 9 to 12 months went by. I started inquiring, and the response we got back from ARB was, well, we think we got your application, but we're not sure. So much time has gone by. We've got a new form. And oh, by the way, the person that used to handle that, they're no longer here. And to be honest with you, I became so disgusted and frustrated with the process. I just kind of threw up my hands and left it alone, because I could prove that they received it. So I just paused that thing. And I guess this is sort of a vote for not trying to take this thing on your own. I'm pretty resourceful. I've been around the industry for a while, and I've dealt with ARB, but this particular group took incompetence and lackadaisical attitude to a whole nother level. So what you guys are talking about is wonderful. My question in chat was, well, do you have existing municipal contracts that others perhaps can piggyback on, since there is compensation being exchanged? There's a couple of things going on. It definitely needs to have a contract if you're a government entity. So that was my question, is do you have existing contracts that can be piggybacked on by other municipal organizations?
Thanks for sharing that, Richard. Evan and I will both take turns on this one. First, you just illustrated why internally to SREC Trade, we refer to the program activity and all the stuff we manage as brain damage. There's a lot that just has to be managed through and stayed on top of to make the program look easy and beneficial, right? Now, we have a lot of municipality and transit agency clients. Interestingly, in the last week and a half, looks like 2 more signed on. Those were direct relationships. We have a lot of direct relationships that aren't going through any kind of a buying, group purchasing, or third-party contract that are direct with the cities. That said, we can work through, and are in other instances working through, master contract, master service agreements with maybe an existing vendor you have. And I'll let Evan pick it up from there.
Yeah, I mean, coming from the public side, procurement and establishing contractual relationships was a significant portion of my work. In transitioning our fleet from CNG to RNG, I had to develop and execute renewable fuel contracts, and we went through solicitations that lasted well over a year, and were not fun to engage in. I'm now having to deal with solicitations on my end, so putting out all those RFPs, now that I'm on the private end, I'm having to respond to them, so I'm getting a taste of my own medicine, I guess. But it's important. I think the public institutions have requirements that private entities don't have. So we're responsive to those. So there's lots of different ways to engage with us. It is a little bit of a unique situation because we're, acting on your behalf and remitting payment to you. So what I would suggest is, talk with us, get a better sense for exactly how the transaction works. And then talk with your procurement folks and your legal team to understand, what's the best way to bring someone like this on board? Do we have to go through, an RFP for a service? Can we do something more informal, get 3 quotes? what would those quotes look like? How do you assess different fees? Make sure it's apples to apples comparison between, you know, what we're saying we're going to charge and what others are going to say. We pride ourselves in transparency to make it easier for you to make that comparison. It's not always easy. Sometimes there's, you know, different systems and different ways of charging for this kind of service, and some of them obscure the real costs. You know, when you talk about incentive programs and credit markets, oftentimes some parties will, you know, hide the ball from you, right? And we try to do the very opposite of that. So just something to keep in mind. And then we are engaged with some municipalities and public transit agencies and other sorts of public entities that may allow for, you know, piggyback contracting. And, you know, obviously we encourage it because it's more efficient for us, but we also know it's much more efficient for you all too. And in the instance of doing a piggyback contract also, our fee structure would probably work to your advantage because there would be more credits being generated and then lower fees for everybody. So, you know, it's an efficiency at scale, and we certainly would love to engage with you on that.
So I had a question for Chris. As you've worked your way through the planning process and the transitioning process, have you run across fleets that haven't faced up to this issue? And the other question for you is, I know that there are people moving into charging as a service into that world where they're going to finance their business model using LCFS. Have you run across that as part of what you've found as you've helped fleets make transition planning happen?
So starting with part 2, we are just starting our first city fleet evaluation, and a lot of what we've done so far has been cities and counties and municipalities. We are just starting our very first one that prefers to do charging as a service. So we are updating our models so it will look at that. I think there are additional complexities that have to do with charging as a service. As the laws around electricity as a motor fuel and how it's taxed and measured go into it. So my answer is, haven't done it yet, gonna be doing it next month. What was the first part of the question, Tim?
Well, it was really just, have you run across fleets that have essentially they're charging with their electric vehicles, they're not doing anything about trying to recover the cost, sort of lost in the woods? Have you run across that? Are you counseling people, get yourself into a situation where you're not just letting this money go away as the kilowatts get pushed through the wires?
We have, you know, everybody that we're working with is a little bit different in their approach. So we have one city that we're working with that they're building a new building right now. They passed a local REACH code about EV charging infrastructure as a requirement of a commercial structure. It's really interesting that REACH code, they don't want to do it themselves. They want everybody else to do it, but they don't want to do it themselves. And to really look at that, we're also trying to figure out how they can double duty that infrastructure, make it available to the public or to residents or guests, and how they might be able to charge some people and not charge the others. So that's a really different use case. City of San Francisco's plan is done, so it's been done for a while, so I can talk about them. They started off by saying we really only want fleet charging. They ended up with lots of public charging that fleets can use as part of their cost recovery model. And City of San Francisco, South San Francisco was before there was LCFS, so we did not factor into that. We're also just starting our very first one where they're looking at the option of vehicle to grid and what does that payback look like if we put in V2G.
When you started talking about facilities, there's a question in the chat about facilities, and it might be more of an REC question than an LCFS question, but could you guys at SREC Trade address that? Sec Trade?
Shrek Trade. SREC Trade is how we say it. It's like there's a hyphen in between the S and the R. SREC Trade.
Can you address that facilities question?
Sure. Evan, you want to take that one?
Yeah, sure. So I think the question is, does the LCFS program incentivize facility assets? The answer is no. It's a transportation fuel incentive program, and so it's solely focused on your fleets. Now, the asset level is the charging equipment, and so that's why we went through all that time to describe how you need to make sure you're metering the charging equipment appropriately so you can report the kilowatt hours that are only used for as a fuel. So electricity is now a fuel, which, you know, up to the LCFS program, it wasn't really considered as such. I want to make sure that I mention that there are assets that your facility may have that can benefit your LCFS participation, and those are solar assets. So if you have solar or any other sort of eligible renewable system, which many of you are considering as part of this charging infrastructure, you can leverage those RECs, those renewable energy credits, in order to generate more LCFS credits. So the RECs themselves you can sell, and there's a market for that. But the real value in the RECs is actually using them in the REC book and claim mechanism that I described earlier to generate more credits. Another thing that is inside of your facility that you may not be considering as a transportation asset, but actually is for CARB, are lift equipment like forklifts, other sorts of yard trucks that are not on road. Even light and heavy rail are actually LCFS eligible. So if you have rail, if you're a metro and you have rail facilities, that is electricity as a transportation fuel. Each of those has its own sort of like reporting requirements and asset registration, and they're all different. And as Richard described earlier, CARB is very overwhelmed with the number of applications and participants. That's saying it as lightly as I can. And so they're not going to really hold your hand and walk you through the regulations and like tell you about how your forklifts need to be reported. They'll reject it when you don't do it right. They're very quick to do that, but they're not always going to help you kind of understand the program. And so you're kind of on your own, and that can be really frustrating when you're thinking about all these complex systems. I wanted to address quickly the charging as a service LCFS question. In my experience, what I've seen is that the charging as a service vendors, suppliers, partners, they typically, and this makes sense, they will undervalue LCFS. So when they're considering what the price point is for your charging as a service, they're going to think about tax rebates and credits. They're going to think about capital expenditures, operating costs, fuel costs, LCFS revenue, and they're going to put all that into $1 amount, right? They will typically undervalue LCFS for a number of reasons. They want to minimize their risk, right? They don't want to overvalue it, offer you a really sweet deal, and then get killed on the back end. So our guidance is typically take that LCFS out of the calculation, take it out of the system, and keep it for yourself. And we obviously have solutions for how to do that in an effective way.
I also want to make the offer that we have some templates that each one of our fleets that we begin to work with, we give them a couple of templates. One is how to do your inventory, because we don't need everything ever about your vehicle, but it helps start shaping the inventory. And the other is a little bit of a questionnaire, like what other things are causing you to do electrification? For some of our cities like Berkeley, they passed a city ordinance that said everything has to be electrified. So is it that, or do you have an upcoming climate action plan, or is this for a private fleet an imperative for the board? So we have some things that help you get yourself ready to start planning. And I will put my email here in the chat, and if you email me, I am happy to share this. There's nothing secret or proprietary about it.
So a question on that is the reporting that everyone has to do April 1st. If you don't know, you do need to report everything over 8,500 GVWR to CARB by April 1st. If you're a government fleet or a private fleet over 50 vehicles or have sales over 50 million, I believe it is. You have to report your vehicle, a bunch of information about your vehicles through the Advanced Clean Truck Regulation. We did have a presentation on that. I think it was the first one of this series, Tim.
February the 24th, yes, and it is posted.
Okay. So is the information in the inventory you're discussing in the same platform or the same reporting criteria as the ACT?
Oh, no, mine is way simpler than that. I don't even ask you for your VIN. But I will tell you, for that ACT reporting, that VIN checker is going to be a lifesaver. Check your VINs before you report, because you do not want a mismatch when you get it to your report.
And then Mike and Evan, there was a question about the whether you can I don't know if you see it there. The question about the charger, whether every kilowatt that goes to the charger qualifies, or whether there may be some things that you're charging, like a neighborhood electric vehicle, that wouldn't qualify as a credit generating use of a kilowatt.
Great question. Thank you. Long story short, there's a long list of eligible pathways, which means cleaner fuel being used in a particular piece of equipment, passenger vehicles, on-road, high, medium duty package trucks, delivery trucks, Class 8 trucks, you name it, off-road, forklifts, yard trucks, tuggers, reach stackers, front loaders, electric cargo handling equipment, you name it. There's a long list. The best way to know what applies is just to have the conversation, talk about your inventory, kind of like what Chris was saying, know your fleet. Let's go through the list of assets and give you a sense of what qualifies and what it's worth to you. For those that qualify, it's all the fuel that is dispensed. So all electricity, every kilowatt hour that goes to the charging station, public or private, for that passenger vehicle, forklift, etc., it qualifies and turns into credits and money for you.
He specifically is asking about neighborhood electric vehicles. Let's just say you had an NEV and a cart and a Chevy Bolt and a Motive step van. They all plug into exactly the same charger, one after the other. You have to know which one is which in order to figure out which kilowatt you can claim and which one you can't.
So there's some it depends there. For each one of these fuel and equipment types, there is a first reporting entity that gets credit or gets to claim the credits. In the case of residential, where you have that issue, for logistical reasons, double counting reasons, etc., the first claimant for these credits is the utility or the load serving entity. Now, again, those rights can be assigned away. So the utility may have the base rights and already be monetizing. However, if you own the charging equipment, right, that's not residential, but in front of an office building or in your private property, that qualifies for the same passenger vehicles. It comes down to who owns where is the charging equipment, and who owns that charging equipment.
So this is a campus, a university that has a charger that's sitting out there, and
that qualifies.
And maybe a truck, maybe a car, maybe a neighborhood electric vehicle. Every kilowatt that goes through it counts.
Absolutely. We have universities and school districts that have such campuses, and they're monetizing those credits.
But any vehicle that charges at that, even if it's not on your list of qualified vehicles, gets credit for the kilowatts that went through that EVSE.
Yes, but Evan wants to talk. Go ahead,
Yeah.
Evan.
So some vehicle types are not eligible. And if you have a unique setup, it may mean that you have to do a dance with CARB. It may mean that you need to come forth with what your setup is. This is what we're doing. This is how our data is reported. Lay it all out there and have a discussion about how you can participate in LCFS and do so in a way that meets their requirements. We do that dance day in and day out. My shoes are worn out, but it's for the best of the industry. And really, we understand what requirements they have and what they're looking for, so we can help frame the situation to make sure that they're getting what they need and that we're doing so in a honest and reportable and verifiable way. So if you have a certain amount of equipment that is not eligible, you may be able to, you know, offset that amount through other sorts of reporting or calculations. But it may put you in a unique situation where you'll have to do a one-on-one sort of, you know, non-standard application. So that's the best answer I can provide without more details.
Got it. Okay.
Tim, I got one private question in the chat, and it would be a long thing for me to chat answer to. When I was talking about the VIN verification, at the very beginning of my presentation, I mentioned that quite often we're getting fleet inventories where the VIN says VIN number, type of vehicle, wrong fuel, because someone didn't go that far over when they were updating VIN. And instead of like going through and checking one by one, the Department of Transportation has a free VIN checking tool that if you drop the number in there, they will tell you type of vehicle, year, date, gross vehicle weight, type of fuel, and all sorts of other information that I bet you didn't even know. And because I know the chat runs dry, I'm going to post the link to that tool in the chat again. And Tim has been using that tool, so he can tell you the ins and outs of it.
Yeah, I was just going to say, if you look at the inventory, your own internal fleet management inventory of vehicles, you'll have a vehicle number, you'll have a VIN number or a serial number in that field. Mr. Vosberg will have more serial numbers than VIN numbers, perhaps because he has a lot of off-road equipment. But you'll also have a field that says fuel type. And you can be, I think Chris was saying, you can be absolutely guaranteed that over the years, your fuel type doesn't match the actual fuel that's going into that vehicle. And so if you run the VIN check, the VIN will tell you what engine it was that was verified on that vehicle. And therefore your natural gas truck isn't in your fleet inventory as a diesel truck. And your Chevy Bolt is not in your vehicle inventory as a gasoline car, which I've seen in VIN data I've received, where either it was a lazy person who was entering the actual data into your data system, or it was a mistake, or who knows what.
We have also seen a lot of year mismatches, like in 1999 Nissan Leaf. So we see a lot of year mismatches too.
It looks like, Mike, were you getting ready to say something? Or
Just when you're done there's another question that was asked early on we haven't addressed yet. I was going to hop back to that if you like.
Well, I wanted to ask Mr. Vosberg. He's a guy that runs a lot of off-road equipment, and I don't know whether has any of this kind of thing started to percolate up in the off-road construction equipment world, Jim? Or is this sort of still a little bit out in the future of what you're going to be dealing with, but not quite yet?
It's a little bit out in the future still, Tim. There are some backhoes and mini excavators available now, but it's rather difficult to charge them, especially if they're going to sit out on a job site. So I did want to say we're a fleet that has sort of ignored this, the LCFS. It just seemed like too much work for us. We only have a dozen or so plug-in hybrids and electric vehicles. We have 2 Envision solar chargers that do track the charging data, and 3 dumb chargers. But this was very enlightening, and I appreciate the information. I think take your advice, and we should get started. We're planning a large charging infrastructure installation in Fresno, and this would be good to get this set up prior to that. So thank you.
Sure. So Mike, you had something I don't know which question it was I missed, but you're still muted, Mike. Mike, you're muted. Yeah.
Thanks. Sorry.
Yeah.
So the question was, can a county or city establish separate LCFS accounts with CARB for claiming credits for multiple departments within the same cities or counties? Great question. So the answer, boiling it down, is that we can enable all to participate and still make sure that each individual department, general ledger code, site is paid in accordance with their assets. Now, we have to do that by managing through our systems and carbs and the kinds of reports and the data in the reports that will identify a general ledger code or a site address or whatever. The accounts, you know, when we're helping you, instead of each of you having to deal with CARB, we are actually, as your agent, managing all that activity and reporting in our account, so that further minimizes the brain damage you have to worry about not having to manage accounts with CARB and their systems, LRT, et cetera. And when we do that, we're just identifying with all the data that identifies uniquely each of those pieces of charging equipment, the FSCs, whatever the fueling supply equipment is. And then the data that identifies that is used to run reports. And when we deposit proceeds into your bank account, you get a report that says, for this single chunk of change, here's how you might break it out. You just run the reports and then allocate it as it makes sense across counties, across whatever the entity is. Now, if the legal entity that is our client, you know, wants to set up multiple separate legal entities because that's where the assets are owned, absolutely, we can do that too. So there's lots of flexibility there.
You know, on that, kind of on that too, Evan even said the H word, hydrogen. I work a lot with sorry, I'm getting tongue-tied now. Hydrogen and fuel cell vehicles. I drive a Clarity, fuel cell Clarity. I'm on my second one. So I'm all about that too. And that is just a whole different structure for LCFS. So if you can imagine that a company like Shell or Iwatani or First Element Fuel can get some grants from the Energy Commission and then the LCFS credits, and they become more of a provider of the station, very much like how folks are doing natural gas now. And they take care of all of that, and then you become a customer of that station. And so it's just a different way of looking at it. And we're seeing some really interesting heavy duty variations go in. The biggest one is Sunline Transit in Palm Springs, and they're putting in a really large electrolyzer, so much so that it's going to be able to fill the entire bus fleet, plus provide hydrogen for a station across the street. And they have a break even on it because of the fuel sales and the LCFS credits. So just keep that in mind. I know that fuel cell trucks are a little farther down the pipeline than battery trucks, but when you're looking at a 10-year plan, that should factor into your 10-year plan.
Thanks again very much to our presenters, Mike and Evan and Chris. Really appreciate it. We've had several people put in the chat that they thought there was great information. We've had a couple people actually say it out loud, so it must be true. Thanks very much to our presenters and to our sponsorship or our relationship with MEMA and NAFA and the 3 Clean Cities coalitions that we partnered with on this.